small town of Elmsworth didn't have much in the way of excitement. It was the kind of place where you could leave your car unlocked overnight, and the biggest event of the week was the Friday night high school football game. But for some reason, that was exactly how most of the people in town liked it. The pace was slow, predictable, and comforting, as if time itself had decided to settle in for a long nap. On a chilly autumn morning, the streets were quiet, save for the occasional car rolling by, the sound of tires humming over the cracked asphalt. The trees lining the sidewalks had begun to change, their leaves turning shades of amber and rust, littering the ground in a soft, crunchy blanket. The air carried the faint smell of damp earth, and if you stood still for long enough, you could hear the distant, low chatter of a neighbor mowing their lawn, or the sound of a dog barking on the next block. It was the kind of town where nothing was too loud, nothing ever really happened. Lena, a junior at the local high school, stepped out of her small brick house just as the sun started to climb over the horizon, casting long slanted shadows along the street. Her backpack hung loosely on one shoulder, a little too heavy from the textbooks stuffed inside. But it didn't matter. School wasn't the problem. It was just routine. That's what life felt like these days. Like everything had been put into a box, wrapped up, and set aside to be dealt with later. Or maybe never at all. She waved to Mrs. Peterson, the older woman who lived the 2 houses down, as she stepped out of her front door with a cup of coffee in hand. Mrs. Peterson waved back, the crinkling corners of her eyes lifting into a smile. There was something comforting about the quiet, simple exchanges between neighbors. Lena had lived here for years, and though she couldn't say she knew everyone well, she recognized the faces. The patterns of movement in the town were predictable. People walked their dogs at the same time each day. The mailman dropped off letters at exactly 10:30 a.m., and the bakery's warm, yeasty smell would drift down Main Street around noon. It was that rhythm of life that made everything feel so safe. But this morning, something felt different. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on. There was no obvious shift in the air, no strange sound or movement to alert her to something wrong. But as Lena made her way down the sidewalk, something in the back of her mind tugged at her, like a subtle disturbance in the flow of things. She paused at the corner just before the turn onto Maple Street and glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Not a car in sight. The street was empty, quiet. A slight breeze kicked up a few leaves, swirling them in a tight circle. She frowned, rubbing the back of her neck. Was it just her imagination, or was it too quiet this morning? Shaking the thought away, she continued walking. The bell above the door to the small convenience store jingled as she stepped inside, and the warmth of the store was a welcome change from the crisp autumn air. Mr. Grant, the owner, was behind the counter as usual, reading the paper, his round glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up when Lena entered, giving her a small nod of acknowledgement. "Mornin', Lena. Same as usual?" he asked, his voice a little gravelly, like he hadn't slept much. "Yeah, thanks," she said, heading to the back of the store where the cooler was stocked with bottles of iced tea. It wasn't much, but it was part of her routine, and it gave her something to do while she waited for the school bell to ring. There was something oddly reassuring about the small, familiar details of her life, how predictable and constant they were. It was the kind of stability everyone around her seemed to take for granted. As she walked back to the counter, Lena's eyes drifted toward the window. Across the street, there was an old house she had passed every day for years. But today, for some reason, it seemed different. The yard, which had always been neatly kept, was overgrown now, the grass curling up in thick tangles. The windows of the house were dark, shuttered, almost like they hadn't been opened in months, and the house itself looked a little more run down than usual, its white paint peeling, the edges of the front porch sagging under the weight of time. Lena blinked, wondering if she was just imagining it. Maybe it was the season. The weather had a way of making everything look a little less polished, a little more worn. "Anything interesting happen around here?" she asked Mr. Grant as she set the iced tea on the counter. Mr. Grant didn't seem to hear her at first. He was still focused on his paper, but then he looked up with a slightly distant expression. "Not much," he said slowly, as if recalling something from a long time ago. "I suppose there's always something, but most folks keep to themselves. You know how it is around here." Lena nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. She paid for her drink and left, stepping back out into the quiet street. The morning sun had risen higher now, and there was a touch of warmth to the air, though the breeze still had a bite to it. The streets were still empty, and as she walked, the sound of her footsteps seemed to echo just a little too loudly against the stillness. She rounded the corner and headed toward the high school, but as she did, her mind kept wandering back to that house across the street, the one with the overgrown yard and the shuttered windows. There was something about it, something off, but she couldn't place it. It was probably nothing. And yet, as the day unfolded in its usual way, with the hum of school bells and the soft chatter of her classmates, Lena couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something in Elmsworth was changing, something just under the surface, and it was only a matter of time before she would have to face it. But that was a thought for another day. Today there were classes to sit through, homework to finish, and the comfort of the familiar rhythm to hold on to. At least for now. For now, everything was normal. The school day stretched on, the usual blend of monotony and routine. The bell rang on schedule, splitting the hours into neat, digestible chunks. Lena found herself moving through it all like she always did, without thinking too much about it. English class, math class, lunch. She sat at the same table as always, with the same group of friends. They talked about homework, about what they'd be doing over the weekend, about nothing in particular. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just the soft hum of life ticking away. The cafeteria smelled faintly of stale bread and overcooked vegetables, a scent so familiar it was almost comforting. Lena picked at her lunch, her mind wandering between the conversations happening around her. Sarah was talking about her plans to visit her aunt in the city next month. Mike was obsessively checking his phone for the latest scores from the football game last night. Nothing about today felt different. Still, that strange feeling, like something was lurking just beyond the edges of her awareness, lingered. It wasn't strong enough to pull her from the routine, but it was there, tugging gently at her thoughts. Whenever the noise of the cafeteria quieted for a moment, a fleeting thought, a half-formed question. She pushed it away, focusing instead on the paper in front of her, scribbling down answers to a math problem she didn't entirely understand. As the minutes ticked by, the feeling only seemed to grow, like a soft murmur in the back of her mind. She glanced up at the clock. It was nearly time for her last class of the day, history. Lena shuffled into the classroom and took her usual seat near the back. The room was a little stuffy, the windows cracked open just enough to let in a cool breeze. The teacher, Mr. Jacobs, was already at the front. His thick glasses perched precariously on the edge of his nose as he sifted through papers on his desk. His voice was a gentle drone, but today it didn't seem to reach Lena. She found herself staring out the window, watching the trees sway outside, their branches moving like silent whispers against the gray sky. It was almost a relief, the quiet of the room. Everyone else was too absorbed in the lesson to notice how absent her mind had become. But something caught her eye. It was just a flicker at first, something moving at the corner of her vision. A shadow, maybe. But when she turned her head, there was nothing there. Just the usual view of the schoolyard, the scattered leaves caught in the wind. The bell rang at the end of class, pulling Lena from her thoughts. She stood up, stretching as she packed her things, the weight of the day settling over her like a blanket. It was time to go home. The air outside had cooled even more, and the sky had darkened into a shade of gray that promised rain soon. She walked the familiar path home, her footsteps a soft rhythm against the pavement. The streets were still quiet, the way they always were. There were fewer cars now, the day winding down as the town began to sink into its evening stillness. Lena's house was just a few blocks away, nestled in a small neighborhood of identical homes with neatly trimmed lawns. Nothing had changed. Not yet. But as she approached the corner where Maple Street met Oak Avenue, she noticed something odd. There was a man standing on the sidewalk near the old house, the one with the overgrown yard and the shuttered windows. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, his hands tucked in the pockets of his coat. His back was to her, but something about his stillness made her pause. It was the kind of quiet stillness that felt unnatural, as if he wasn't just waiting for something, but being waited on. Lena hesitated for a moment, watching him. Then, feeling silly for lingering on such a small detail, she continued walking, but she couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder as she passed. The man was still there, standing motionless, his figure a dark silhouette against the house. For a second, she thought she saw him turn his head, though she couldn't be sure. She shook it off and made her way home. The door to her house opened with a familiar creak, the warmth of the living room enveloping her. Her mom was in the kitchen, humming quietly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. The sound of a radio played softly in the background. It was all so normal, the kind of normal that was almost too normal. Lena dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes. The house smelled like freshly baked bread, the kind her mom always made on days when there was nothing else to do. She headed into the kitchen, standing by the counter as her mom looked up, offering her a smile. "How was school?" her mom asked. "Fine," Lena said, picking at a piece of the bread her mom had just taken out of the oven. "Same as usual." "Good," her mom replied, her voice light. "We're having stew for dinner. Your favorite?" Lena smiled faintly, but the strange feeling still lingered, buzzing just below the surface. She couldn't shake it off, no matter how hard she tried. That night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the house was quieter than usual. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft rustling of the trees outside, all of it blended together in a low, steady drone. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt like something was waiting. Lena turned onto her side, trying to will herself to sleep. The moonlight seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across her room. And in the dim light, for just a moment, she thought she saw something moving at the edge of her vision. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and then looked again. There was nothing there. The night carried on as it always did, with its familiar sounds and rhythms. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break the quiet, that whatever had been hidden in the background of her life for so long was slowly, quietly making itself known, and she wasn't sure how much longer she'd be able to ignore it. The quiet of Elmsworth seemed to stretch a little longer each day, as if the town was holding its breath. Each morning, the streets felt the same, empty and calm, with a soft stillness hanging in the air. But the odd sense that something wasn't quite right, something lurking beneath the surface, continued to gnaw at Lena despite her attempts to ignore it. The feeling had woven itself so tightly into the fabric of her days that at times it was all she could think about. It wasn't anything she could point to directly. It wasn't the man standing by the old house, his figure still and silent, always watching from afar. It wasn't the strange way the trees seemed to sway, just a bit too much in the breeze, as though they were shifting with the wind, not just responding to it. It wasn't even the overgrown yard of that house, now so wild that it almost looked as if it were trying to overtake the property, creeping toward the sidewalk as if it had a life of its own. It was all of it, stitched together into something that felt wrong. Lena walked home from school one afternoon with her mind full of the usual distractions, tests to study for, weekend plans to sort out, and the latest gossip that had been circling the hallways. Yet, as she rounded the corner to Maple Street, her eyes unconsciously shifted to the old house across the road. The house was a fixture in the neighborhood, just like the aging oak tree on the corner, or the faded yellow street signs. It had always been there, forgotten by most, an unremarkable relic of a different time. But that day, the house seemed different. It wasn't that it had changed in any dramatic way. It wasn't falling apart or crumbling, but something about it felt more present. There was a heaviness to it now, an oppressive stillness that lingered in the air around it. Lena couldn't remember a time when it had felt so alive, its very presence pulling at her in ways she couldn't explain. She paused halfway down the sidewalk, the afternoon sun casting long, narrow shadows across the street. The man who had been standing there before, he wasn't in sight anymore, but something still lingered in the space where he had been. Lena glanced at the house, her heartbeat quickening for no obvious reason. She told herself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. But then she noticed something else. The shutters on the upper windows, the ones that had always been shut tight, were slightly ajar now. Just a crack, barely noticeable. But there, the wind picked up a little and she watched as a single leaf, bright red, drifted down from one of the trees in the yard, falling slowly to the ground. Everything about the scene felt off, like a moment held just a beat too long. She shook her head and walked on, trying to focus on the more familiar sights ahead. The quiet hum of the town seemed to surround her, but it was muffled, as though the noise had been turned down, just enough to make her feel out of place. When she got home, she pushed the thoughts aside and dove into the rhythm of her evening, helping her mom prepare dinner, flicking through the pages of her textbooks and slipping into the comfortable patterns of her life. But it kept returning. The unease. That evening, while she was finishing her math homework in her room, she heard it. The sound, faint but clear enough to make her pause. A soft, rhythmic tapping. She tilted her head, trying to place it. It didn't sound like the wind or the trees. It wasn't the usual creak of the house settling, or the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. This was something different, more deliberate. It seemed to come from outside, from just beyond her window, though when she glanced out, the yard was empty. Lena tried to push it out of her mind, but the tapping continued, persistent and steady. It was almost like a knock, soft but purposeful. She got up and crossed the room, moving toward the window. The moonlight bathed everything in a pale glow, and the shadows of the trees cast strange, elongated shapes across the ground. Everything appeared as it should. Nothing was there. But the sound, it didn't stop. She opened the window just enough to hear more clearly, her heart thumping loudly in her chest, though she couldn't pinpoint why. There was nothing but the soft rustling of the wind and the stillness of the street stretching out in front of her. She closed the window and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. But in the silence that followed, she could swear that the tapping was still there, just on the edge of her hearing. It was as if it was following her, whispering at her back when she wasn't paying attention. The next day, Lena tried to focus on her usual routine. School was just school after all. Her friends chatted around her in the hallways, and Mr. Jacobs droned on in history class, as he always did. But her eyes kept flicking to the window, her mind tugging back to the strange noise from the night before. By lunchtime, she found herself staring out across the quad, the thought of the old house creeping back into her thoughts. She couldn't help it. It had been bugging her for days now, and she couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. And as she looked, something strange caught her eye. It wasn't the usual sight, no familiar cars parked on the curb, no neighbors coming and going. There, just for a moment, she saw a shadow dart across the yard of the old house. It was quick, far too quick to be a person, more like the shifting of something large, something that had been hiding there in plain sight, but was now starting to move. She blinked. The shadow was gone. Her stomach twisted in a way that made her feel suddenly sick, her hands gripping the edges of the lunch table. She glanced at her friends, but they were all absorbed in their own conversations. No one else seemed to notice. Lena's gaze flicked back to the old house, but there was nothing at all. Still, that strange, unsettled feeling didn't fade. It seemed to follow her through the rest of the day, weaving its way into every thought, every movement. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, the shadows from the trees outside stretching and shifting with the wind. It was only when she heard the tapping again, soft but steady, that she realized she hadn't imagined it. It was real, but where was it coming from? Lena had always been someone who could push her fears aside. She was used to ignoring the little things that made her uneasy, the shadows that seemed too thick at night, the strange noises that never quite made sense, the feeling that something was just there, in the periphery, waiting. But this was different. This was real. The tapping, the whispers, the way the air itself felt heavy, like something was watching, waiting, and it was all she could think about. That night she couldn't sleep. The moonlight pooled over the floor in long, thin ribbons, casting an eerie glow across her room. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, but it wasn't the wind that had her heart racing. No, it was the sound, the tapping, soft at first, like a faraway drumbeat, but now louder, closer. Every time the sound came, her chest tightened, her breath growing shallow as if the very rhythm of it was starting to control her pulse. Tap, tap, tap. It came from somewhere in the house, but it wasn't from the usual places. It wasn't the creak of the floorboards in the hallway or the gentle hum of the refrigerator downstairs. No, this was different. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, from inside. Lena tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, that her mind was running away with her, but the sound wouldn't stop. She sat up in bed, gripping the sheets tightly, her nails digging into the fabric. The house was so quiet, but the tapping broke that silence in a way that felt unnatural, like it was an intrusion, an echo from some other place. Her heart thudded in her chest, and a cold sweat began to form along the back of her neck. The temperature in the room had dropped, the air thick with something heavy, like it had been holding its breath along with her. Tap, tap. It came from behind the wall at the foot of her bed. She could feel it, a pulse of sound that almost seemed to resonate in her bones. Her mouth went dry, and she found herself frozen in place, staring at the corner of the room where the wall met the floor. The quiet was deafening, broken only by that rhythmic tapping that seemed to fill the space around her. Her eyes darted to the window, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at her through the darkness. But the glass was still, the street outside bathed in the cold, dim light of the street lamp. No one, nothing, just the dark. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything went silent, and Lena thought, just for a brief, fleeting moment, that maybe it was over. Maybe it was nothing after all. But then it started again. Closer, louder. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew, not just in volume, but in something else. Something wrong. The tapping became frantic, desperate, almost like it was trying to break through the wall itself. Lena's breath hitched, a strangled gasp caught in her throat. She slid out of bed, the cool floorboards pressing against her bare feet. Her head spun with dizziness, but she forced herself to move. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't just ignore it anymore. The hallway outside her room was dark, the shadows stretching far longer than they should. Lena moved quickly, trying to quiet the pounding of her heart, trying to steady her hands as they reached for the light switch. Her fingers brushed the switch, but before she could flick it on, the air seemed to shift. The house seemed to groan, a deep, low sound that vibrated through the walls. Then there was another sound, a scratching. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was something dragging against the wall, something slow and purposeful. Lena's blood ran cold. Shink, shink. It came from directly below her feet, from the floorboards. Slowly, she crouched down, her knees trembling as she sank lower to the ground. The sound had a rhythm now, a jagged pattern, almost like nails being scraped across the wood. She wasn't sure why she did it, but she reached out, her fingers brushing against the floor. The coldness beneath her hand made her flinch, her skin prickling with an unnatural chill. And then, with a jolt that sent her heart racing, the floorboard beneath her shifted. It wasn't like the usual creaks of the house settling. No, this was deliberate. The wood moved, as though something was pushing it up from underneath. Lena jerked her hand back, her breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She couldn't look away from the spot on the floor where the board had shifted, her whole body tense, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. The scratching stopped. For a moment, it was eerily quiet. Lena's hand hovered over the edge of the floorboard, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out of this house, to escape whatever was happening. But something kept her frozen in place. Something compelled her to stay, as though the house itself was pulling her in, whispering her name in a voice that only she could hear. Then it came, Slowly, reluctantly, the wooden board lifted, creaking against the weight of whatever was beneath it. Lena's breath caught in her throat. A hand, long, pale, and bony, slipped through the gap in the floor, followed by another, thin fingers curling over the edge of the wood. She recoiled instinctively, but she couldn't pull away. It was as if her feet were cemented to the floor, her body trapped in place by the very presence of whatever was trying to emerge. A whisper came then, soft and cold, like a breeze brushing against her skin. A voice. "Help me," it rasped. The words cut through her like a blade, each syllable scraping across her nerves, sending a shiver down her spine. Lena's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with something she couldn't see, something pressing against her, like the walls themselves were closing in. Tap, tap, tap. The sound continued, but it was different now. It wasn't just a tapping anymore. It was a beating, rhythmic and relentless, like something was pounding at the walls, trying to get out. Lena's eyes locked onto the hand that had emerged from beneath the floor. It wasn't just pale, it was rotting. The skin was thin, almost translucent, with veins bulging under the surface. The flesh so taut, it looked like it would tear at any moment. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it came again. "Help me. Let me out." Lena couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She reached forward, her hand shaking uncontrollably, and before she could stop herself, she pressed it against the floor, against the cold wood that trembled beneath her touch. Lena's hand pressed against the cold floor, the texture of the wood rough under her palm. The hand that had emerged from beneath the floorboards, pale, skeletal, and impossibly thin, began to move, its fingers curling in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It dragged itself further into the room, dragging the rest of the arm with it, as if it had been waiting beneath the house for far too long. The whispering voice, raspy and desperate, echoed in her mind. "Help me. Let me out." Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat loud and frantic, as though it were fighting against the oppressive weight in the air. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, locked in place by a terror so deep, it felt like it was coming from the very walls around her. The air in the room thickened, colder now, biting at her skin as the figure beneath the floor inched closer. Lena's mind raced, but her body refused to listen. She could feel the pulse of the thing beneath the floor, the rhythm of its movement, like a slow, steady thrum against her ribs. The sound of it, the scraping, the unnatural dragging of its body filled her ears. But it was the whisper that sank into her bones, that gnawed at her, dragging her deeper into the paralyzing fear. "Help me." Her eyes were glued to the arm, now fully visible, stretching up through the hole in the floor. The fingers twitched, the nails long and yellow, twisted into grotesque shapes. They were reaching for her, stretching, writhing. The room seemed to pulse with each breath she took, the space between her and the thing growing smaller, tighter, as if the room itself was closing in, as if it, too, wanted to consume her. Lena's breath was shallow now, the air too thin, too heavy. She felt lightheaded, dizzy, the world spinning around her as the creature's grip on her reality tightened. Her chest felt hollow, like something was emptying inside of her, something she couldn't control, something she couldn't stop. The whisper continued, a thin thread that wound its way through her thoughts, twisting and pulling at her sanity. "Help me." And then, just as the fingers were about to touch her skin, just as the cold, rotting flesh was almost within reach. Lena's body moved of its own accord. With a gasp, she yanked her hand back, stumbling backwards onto the cold floor. The room spun around her, the shadows twisting, and for a moment, she felt like she might fall into them, disappear into the dark. The creature paused. The whispering stopped. For a second, everything was still. The weight in the room seemed to lift, the chill in the air receding, just enough to give her a breath of relief. She could hear her own ragged breathing, her pulse pounding in her ears. But the whisper, the call, was gone. Lena sat there on the floor, trembling, her hands pressed to her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her heart beneath her fingertips. The house was silent now, too silent, as if it were waiting for her to move, waiting for her to do something. But what? What could she do? And then, just as Lena began to rise, trying to steady herself, the air shifted once again. It was subtle, but she felt it, like a shift in gravity. The walls seemed to exhale, as if the house had been holding its breath the entire time, waiting for her to make a move. Lena turned, her eyes darting toward the corner of the room. There, beneath the dim light of the moon, she saw it. A figure. Not the thing from beneath the floor, but someone else. A woman. Tall, thin, her features indistinct, as though her face had been blurred by some unseen force. She was standing in the far corner of the room, her back to Lena, her hair hanging loosely down her back, swaying with a motion that wasn't quite natural. For a long, agonizing moment, Lena couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't do anything but stare at the figure in the corner. The woman who wasn't supposed to be there. The woman who had been waiting for her. The figure turned slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. Lena's stomach dropped as she saw the woman's face. Her eyes were empty, hollowed out spaces like stretched on, and he felt as though he were suffocating in it. The air around him thickening, pressing in on him from all sides. His eyes scanned the apartment once more. The corners of the room seemed darker now, the shadows deepening as if they were pooling and shifting, moving in ways they shouldn't. The windows were dim, the streetlights outside flickering in time with the pounding in his head. There was no escape. Rodney's gaze shot to the photograph on the floor. The figure in the background of the image. He could almost see it now, more clearly than before. The blur wasn't random. It wasn't just an artifact of the old camera. It was something, someone. The figure in the photograph stood behind him now. He could feel it, its presence behind him like a weight that pressed into his skin. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. "Don't turn around." Rodney's breath caught in his throat. His legs refused to move. His mind screamed for him to run, to open the door, to do anything. But his body was paralyzed by something stronger than fear. His eyes were wide, darting between the walls, between the flickering lights, between the suffocating silence that pressed closer and closer. "Don't turn around, Rodney." The voice, soft and insistent, was everywhere now. It wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from inside the room, inside his head, inside the very walls that surrounded him. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Rodney's body moved on its own. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned around. What he saw, what he felt, made his breath stop entirely. There was something there, something standing at the far end of the room. A shape, a shadow, The figure didn't move at first. It stood still, its outline indistinct, as though it was composed of darkness itself, shifting in the corners of his vision. But Rodney knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was aware of him, that it was watching him, waiting. The temperature dropped further, a sharp sting of cold that made the hairs on his arms stand straight. And then the whisper came again, this time no longer a voice, but a breath, a cold, unrelenting breath against the back of his neck. "You shouldn't have opened the letter." The whisper cut through the stillness again, sharp and intimate, like a secret shared only between the dark corners of the room and the space between his ribs. "You shouldn't have opened the letter." Rodney's legs trembled, his breath coming in jagged gasps. The room felt too small, too tight, the walls pressing in on him as if the very air had turned to lead. He could feel it now, the figure, like an oppressive weight hovering in the shadows at the far end of the room, waiting for him to acknowledge it, waiting for him to react. But he couldn't. He couldn't look directly at it. Not yet. It was as though the moment he turned his gaze toward it, it would take form. It would become real, in ways he couldn't handle. His eyes darted around the room in a desperate search for anything familiar, anything that could anchor him back to the normal, the safe, the real. But everything had shifted. Nothing felt solid anymore. Not the floor beneath his feet, not the walls, not even the stale air. "It's too late now." The whisper was louder, more insistent, vibrating in his skull like a cruel melody. Rodney felt something in his chest tighten, a knot pulling tight around his heart, a sinking sensation, as though the ground beneath him was crumbling away. His mind raced, his thoughts scattered and unformed, desperate for a way out, any way out. The letter, the photograph, had been just the beginning. He realized that now. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for him, waiting for the moment when he would cross a line, when he would open that letter and let whatever was inside slip into his world. It had been watching him all along, his pulse hammered in his throat. The darkness at the far end of the room seemed to shift, to move, as if something within it was stirring. For a fleeting moment, Rodney thought he saw it. A hand, pale and thin, reaching out from the shadows, fingers twitching in the still air. But before he could react, the light overhead flickered again, casting the room in a deeper darkness, pulling the shadows further into the corners. And then came the sound, a low scrape like nails against wood. It was distant at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, drawing closer. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second, pressing in on him from all sides. Rodney felt his throat tighten. The darkness didn't just fill the room now, it invaded it. The space he had once known, the place that had been his sanctuary, was no longer his own. His hand moved instinctively toward the door. It was his only option. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. The hallway beyond had to be safe. It had to be black pits where nothing existed. Her mouth was open, but no sound came. The whisper, "Help me," came again, but this time it wasn't from the floor. It was from the figure. It was her voice, though it sounded far too distant, far too detached from the woman standing in front of Lena. Lena's mind screamed, but no words came out. She was trapped, frozen in place by the gaze of the thing in the corner. But then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the woman's face changed. Her mouth twisted into a smile. Not a kind smile, but one that was far too wide, far too wrong. And in that smile, Lena saw something else. something that made her blood run cold. The woman's teeth were jagged, broken, and sharp, as if they had been ground down over time, like something that had been worn away by years of hunger. "Help me." The whisper came again, this time distorted, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Lena blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. The room was empty. It was as if nothing had happened. The walls were still, the floor was still, and the oppressive weight that had filled the space was gone. But Lena knew it hadn't been a dream. She knew. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the air thick around her as she rose to her feet, unsure if her legs would hold her. She turned toward the door, but when she reached for the knob, she froze. The house felt different. The air didn't feel right. It wasn't the same as it had been before. And then she saw it, on the wall, where she had never seen it before. A small phrase had appeared in scrawled, jagged handwriting, as if someone, something, had written it there in the dark. "Let me out." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The air around her went still once more, and in the silence that followed, she realized with chilling clarity that she hadn't been the one trapped here all along. It had been waiting for her. It always had.